This is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And as you can probably tell, Isaac is a little bit under the weather today.
That's right. We took a little time between recording part 1 and recording part 2. And in the interim, I somehow managed to catch a cold in July of all goddamn times. And so that's why I sound like I picked up chain smoking.
Well, fortunately for you, we're actually going to talk a lot about medicine in this episode, and I think you're going to walk away from this one with some excellent ideas about how to cure that cold.
This is medicine in the 1600s we're talking about?
Oh, yeah, baby.
Yeah, I'll take the cold, thanks.
So, we are back for part 2 of our story of the death of Thomas Overbury. And if you haven't listened to part 1, I strongly recommend that you do that. Otherwise, you are going to be extremely confused about who all these people are and what is going on and why are we talking about witchcraft? Oh my God, what is happening?
You will also miss some really excellent historical erectile dysfunction related arguments. And I don't know why you'd want to miss that. So,
all right. So just a reminder for folks who are catching up from last time, Thomas Overbury is pretty much the least popular guy in King James's court. He manages to piss off the king himself, the queen, the king's favorite, the woman the king's favorite is in love with, the extremely powerful noble family of the woman the king's favorite is in love with, and the many people the king's favorite was grifting in exchange for political favors. So, we're going to set up a little murder mystery here. And right off the bat, a lot of people would love it if this guy dropped dead.
Yeah, this is really making me think of that One Onion headline with the JFK assassination, where like 40 different people try to assassinate him at the same time.
Yeah, this is not a very popular man. So, the circumstances of his death. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London by the king himself under some not quite legal circumstances after he refused to become the ambassador to Russia. A fate not quite worse than death, but not really a great situation in the early 1600s, and especially not right after an extremely troubled period of time in Russian history that any ambassador would have to be dealing with.
Does Russia have non-troubled times in its history? Has there ever been a time in Russia that was just like, okay?
I think they've had a couple of okay years maybe in there in the last, millennium. So Thomas Overbury, world's least popular man, dies on September 15th, 1613. And this is not exactly a cause for mass mourning. His family is pretty upset that he's dead, but outside of that, pretty much nobody really seems to care, at least initially. He's just 32 years old, but his death is not really considered much of a surprise. Part of the reason he had been declining to go to Russia is that he had been telling the king that his health was too poor for a foreign posting. And during his period of confinement, his health deteriorated very badly. So it certainly did seem like this very sickly guy dies. Okay, that's not suspicious, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are better things for you for a certainty than to stay in the Tower of London.
At the time of his death, a rumor actually spreads that the cause of death was venereal disease. And this rumor is substantiated by the fact that his body is absolutely disgusting. Shortly after death, it stinks very, very badly. It decomposes very quickly. And before he died, he had quite a few open sores. So he was looking and smelling pretty rough before he passed.
I mean, I was going to make a good for him joke, but honestly, you're just taking the fun out of it now.
Yeah, this guy's death was not fun at all. His body was pretty wasted, both by whatever actually killed him, and because doctors had been administering purgatives in an attempt to cure him. So, not really a good way to go. Quite a lot coming out of every end. And which I did have to read about in quite a lot of detail, all of this man's stools and vomits.
That's medicine?
That's medicine. This is the age when it's a little bit before what's considered the age of heroic medicine, I believe, but it is an age when A lot of medical treatments are things like bleeding people. That's kind of a holdover from the Middle Ages that, oh, you got some bad humors in your blood. We got to bleed some of it out. But also making people vomit and get diarrhea. That would be considered a possible cure. And it is true that for some diseases, for instance, if you get food poisoning and you vomit, and you probably did get food poisoning quite a bit in the age before modern preservatives, it is quite possible that there were conditions that those treatments could cure. But whatever Thomas Overbury actually had, and it's a little bit unclear what he was actually sick with, certainly did not cure him to do that.
It's a real kind of a backhanded compliment to medicine of this period that the lukewarm defense of it is, oh, maybe there are some things it could actually cure.
Yeah, it could cure maybe a few things. It certainly did not cure the vast majority of things it was used to treat.
Counterpoint, he's dead. He's not sick anymore.
True, they did solve that problem. And Overbury's death actually solves another problem. Because while Overbury's body is rotting, his former best friend Robert Carr sees his already bright future get even better. Because just days after Overbury's death, Frances Howard gets her annulment, which she has been fighting for in that complicated cursed witch dick situation that we talked about in the last episode.
Well, good for her. I'm glad that she is free of her cursed witch dick. And this all just seems very above board and normal.
A completely normal, completely average, above board way to get an annulment by saying that your husband's penis has been cursed by a witch. And now, plans for her marriage to Robert Carr can go full steam ahead. Everything is coming up Robert. In short order, the king grants him an earldom, specifically so that when Frances marries him, she will not have to go down in station from her previous marriage. The king's like, let's just bump you up a little bit so that Frances gets a nice, sweet deal here. Robert gets appointed Treasurer of Scotland, and King James himself actually pays for his wedding to Frances. King James, despite the fact that Robert Carr is not just the king's favorite in a political sense, but, quite possibly
In the
sleeping with
bedroom
him.
sense, yeah.
In the bedroom sense, yes. You'll see a lot of historians kind of hedge their bets about, like, we don't really know what King James did in the bedroom, but we do have enough correspondence from him and his favorites to, we can hazard some guesses.
Look, I appreciate, as much as the next historian, a little hedging around what is or is not in a primary source. But come on, guys. I don't think they were just roommates.
Yeah, but James is actually quite cool with the idea of his totally not just roommates guys getting married. He understands that this is a really important thing for anyone who's involved in politics to do to make favorable marriages. And of course, the Howard family that Robert Carr is marrying into they're tight with the king. They're actually people who in the past had not gotten along really well with Robert Carr, which is something that the king had always found distressing. So for King James, this is great. The guy that he's really tight with gets married into the family that he's really tight with. This is great news for him. And not long after this, Carr also gets appointed Lord Chamberlain of the Household, which is the highest position you can get in the royal household. So great for James, who's paying for this wedding. Now his favorite has a very high position, has connections to a very powerful family. Seems perfect. What could go wrong?
Yeah, this all seems above board and normal. Sounds like our shortest episode yet.
But then, after Robert Carr has risen to these dizzying heights, he begins his descent. Because by 1614, Carr has managed to accumulate quite a lot of enemies. He has a long-standing habit of demanding money in exchange for recommending people to the king for jobs and titles. We talked about that a bit in the previous episode. But the issue is now he is starting to have trouble delivering on his promises. It may be the case that Frances is also getting involved in making some of these promises and then not keeping them. But what's happening here is he is taking quite a lot of money under the table, and then he is not actually delivering the plum positions he says that he could get for people. That's not great. A lot of
Yeah.
very powerful people do not like that so much.
Yeah, I imagine people would take that a little personally.
Some of Robert Carr's many enemies get together and they say, how can we undermine his position? And they come up with an idea. They are going to replace him as the king's favorite because Carr has gotten so comfortable with his position that he's often outright insolent to James. And of course, he's increasingly distracted by his sexy new wife. So whatever might or might not have been going on sexually between them, there's now another party involved who's getting in the way. So Carr's enemies go out searching for a hot new babe.
And I'm assuming they find one. There's got to be at least one in the wide-ranging land of England.
They do. They find a handsome young man named George Villiers. Have you ever heard of George Villiers?
That name does actually sound familiar, but God help me if I remember from where.
He becomes a very famous politician in his own right, and he meets a sticky end that we might actually discuss in a different episode of this podcast.
Well, tell me more. I want to know.
George has a lot to recommend him as a potential favorite to the king. First off, Queen Anne actually likes him. Queen Anne is not really a fan of Robert Carr at this point, in part because of the insolence of his former best friend, now deceased Thomas Overbury. George Villiers is a fantastic dancer. He's great at conversation and total babe. James actually thinks this guy is as handsome as an angel.
Ooh, I mean, that's definitely a normal thing that two roommates would say about each other.
Oh, James goes on to say a lot of really normal things about George Villiers. I believe he used to call Villiers his dog, and there's some correspondence between them where Villiers refers to himself as a dog sleeping on his master's bed.
Yo, this is like a weird kink thing. I mean, no judgment, like, don't want to yuck anyone's yums, but like, this is not a great way to run a monarchy, is what I'm getting at.
James was not a very good king. He would have been the best messy twink on Fire Island in like 2005, though. He really missed his calling there.
Yeah, I mean, really, that's the tragedy of monarchy when you get down to it.
So Carr's enemies not only bring handsome young George Villiers to court so he can spend more time around James, they pay for his expensive wardrobe budget so that he'll look his best for the king. So they've brought this hot young babe to court. They deck him out in all the latest fashion, and they say, go, impress the king, basically steal Robert Carr's position away from him. And it works. James begins to shift his affection, and while this plot is going on, Carr's enemies get a very convenient surprise because Richard Weston, Overbury's jailer, comes forward and he tells a wild story. So by 1615, rumors have begun circulating at court that Thomas Overbury's death was not natural. In life, not many people actually really seem to enjoy the company of Thomas Overbury. But after his death, when nobody has to suffer through hanging out with him, his reputation has undergone a bit of a transformation. Some of his satirical writing, in which he made fun of many of the sort of pompous figures at court, has been published to great acclaim. And he starts being portrayed less as a power-grubbing loser and more as a gentleman of noble character who was done in by his corrupt friends like Robert Carr.
Yeah, that's what happens to all gentlemen of noble characters. They die in the Tower of London, probably of horrific venereal diseases.
While shitting themselves to death. So Weston starts getting pretty nervous about these rumors about Thomas Overbury's death, and he decides what he needs to do is get his side of the story out first. So he ends up giving a statement to some of Carr's enemies, and they take that statement to the king in order to discredit Carr. So I'm going to tell you the story that the prosecution is going to end up running with. And that is a combination of the original story that Weston the jailer tells, Some creative interpretation of correspondence recovered from various parties involved, and inference based on evidence found in the homes of the accused. So remember back when the King's Commission was getting to the bottom of that cursed penis situation with Frances Howard's first husband?
Oh, do I ever?
According to Weston, during that time, Frances Howard and some of her associates start behaving in a manner that is distinctly suspicious towards Thomas Overbury. Weston starts to suspect that the Howards are trying to off the prisoner to prevent him from getting involved in this whole marriage annulment and remarriage to Robert Carr situation. And Weston says that he has a good reason for this suspicion. Frances keeps visiting him at work, and she keeps helpfully giving him things like special water for the prisoner, and then handing over things like extremely suspicious vials full of greenish water and saying, just feed this to the prisoner. It's medicine. It's good for him. Don't worry about it.
Sounds above board to me.
So Weston instead takes this special water to his boss, Sir Gervase Elwes, who himself owed his position to Carr and the Howards. The two of them had actually been urging Overbury to make peace with the Howards in order to secure his release from the Tower. So this is, being in the Tower of London can be kind of a strange situation. On one hand, you're a prisoner, but you're not necessarily a prisoner in the sense that you're in manacles in the basement. He is being confined by the king, but he's also kind of a guest of the king, but also the people who are keeping him confined have some connections to the Howards. It's a weird situation. Weston and Elwes come up with a plan. They will keep accepting whatever suspicious items Frances and her cronies pass along, but they're not going to feed anything that she gives them to the prisoner. They're going to divert them and give the prisoner food that is presumably not poisoned instead. So Frances sends the prisoner poisoned tarts and jellies, at least according to Weston. And they know this because she's making sure to warn Weston and Elwes not to eat any. This is a time period where, some professional standards were a little lax. If you got handed some lovely looking jellies at work, you might be tempted to take some home to your wife and kids instead of passing them along to the guy who was supposed to receive them. So Frances is basically showing up with very shady gift baskets and saying, please make absolutely sure your children don't eat any of this. It's totally fine, totally above board, but absolutely do not feed this to your children.
I'm sure she's just a stickler for proper gift-giving etiquette.
According to the prosecution, at least, who tell this story at court, how is Frances getting all this poison? Well, remember her friend Anne Turner, who introduced her to a man who helped win Robert Carr's heart via witchcraft? Mrs. Turner has more than one shady doctor acquaintance, so she introduces another of her friends to Frances, and that is a man named Simon Franklin, who is a very shady physician. Dr. Franklin helps the conspirators procure a variety of poisons to hide in jellies and tarts, and Mrs. Turner helps Frances pass food along for Overbury. How is Frances able to send the prisoner so much food? And why would she believe that Overbury would accept food from her? Because Robert Carr, who Overbury still believes is his best friend, is also sending the prisoner food as an excuse to pass on correspondence, or even possibly as a way of hiding letters inside the food that's being delivered. So Carr is hiding letters in food for Overbury, and then, according to the prosecution, Frances is hiding poison in food. So here is a really confusing twist in the prosecution's story. They have correspondence from the conspirators talking about passing letters to Overbury in prison. They don't actually have any written evidence at all talking about poison. So they reason that every time Frances writes about passing letters concealed in food to Overbury, that's actually a secret code. And what she really means is that she's actually passing poison concealed in food to Overbury, and then for some reason, writing letters to other people and saying, oh, I passed this letter along.
Well, I can see how one might draw that conclusion. I am seeing a pretty immediate issue with this whole surmise, which is that you would need some evidence, one presumes, that there's a code word being used here, and there doesn't seem to be one or any evidence other than just the vibes.
Oh, sir, if you have problems with vibes-based evidence, the legal arguments that are coming up in this episode are going to be rough for you, because the vibes are about to get even wilder.
All right, what do the vibes say come next?
Well, first of all, we have to talk about what Carr and Overbury were corresponding about. Because remember, Carr was Overbury's most influential friend and supporter at court. He had the ear of the king. So Overbury, he believes that Carr can convince the king to release him from his unlawful imprisonment in the Tower of London. So he's writing letters to his friend, and Carr is writing back. And Overbury at least believes that Carr is on his side, and he's trying to come up with a scheme to get Carr to help him get out of prison. And if Carr can't convince the king by persuading him, maybe he can help him by poisoning Overbury just a little bit. That's right. At the same time that Francis is supposedly poisoning Overbury, Overbury is begging Carr to poison him. Specifically, he wants Carr to send him an emetic, which will make him just sick enough to prove to the king he's really too ill to be an ambassador, and thus should be set free.
This is a terrible plan.
Yeah, Thomas Overbury, not really the greatest planner. Robert Carr, not really the greatest planner either. We are not really working with the A game of English strategists here.
I have so many questions, but also most of the questions are just what and why.
Eventually, the correspondence between Carr and Overbury turns sour. Overbury starts threatening to expose a terrible secret if Carr doesn't help him get free. He doesn't say exactly what secret he's threatening to expose, but whatever it is, it seems like something that might genuinely have Carr worried. And at least according to the prosecution, Francis's plan to smuggle poison into the prison in the form of food is a bust because Weston and Elwes are diverting all of the poisonous food. But Overbury is actually getting very sick. So she tries a new tactic and she switches out his medicines for poison. According to the prosecution, Francis has her cronies swap out a medicinal enema intended for Overbury with mercury sublimate, which is definitely not something that you want to put up your butt if you value living.
She killed him by getting a doctor to shove mercury up his ass.
Yes, that is the prosecution's argument. Overbury died from having mercury shot up his butt because Francis did a swapsies with the, I'm sure, good and helpful enema that he should have been receiving instead.
I mean, I guess it would work. That'll kill somebody, yeah.
If this is true, yes, it would absolutely kill you to shoot mercury up your butt. Don't do that. Mercury was actually something that people in this time period were particularly fascinated about. It's a very weird chemical in its raw form. It certainly seemed to a lot of people like it must have some kind of magical property. So Carr's enemies take part of this story, specifically Weston's confessions about Francis' suspicious behavior with the food and the special water. So the enema part of the story actually comes in later. That's not the initial story. So they take this part of the story about Francis being the poisoner to the king. And this puts King James in a very awkward position because the prisoner was under the king's control in the tower and he'd been imprisoned at the king's command. The king was technically responsible for his welfare. He must now order an investigation into murder accusations against his own favorite. And to make things even more awkward, Overbury hadn't really been legally imprisoned. As we talked about in the last episode, pissing off the king is actually not a crime in this time period. So the fact that Overbury was even in the tower in the first place is something that could cause some awkward questions to be raised about James's behavior if anyone cares to look too closely into this story. So James is in a really tight spot here. Things are getting real awkward for him. He looks around for a person who can lead this investigation. And he chooses a man who is a friend of Carr's, who he believes is likely to go easy on Carr. And unfortunately for James, the man he chooses is a man named Sir Edward Coke, who is the Lord Chief Justice. Coke is a guy who loves prosecuting people. He wants to be the 17th century version of a celebrity judge, and he decides this is the high-profile case that is going to make him a legend. Even though James chose him specifically because he thought he'd go easy on Robert Carr as his friend, Coke sees a chance to make a name for himself by presiding over a big sensational trial. So he runs with it. And oh boy, he runs all the way with it.
This seems like a very bad idea, though, to just be like, well, I know what the king wants, but like, YOLO.
I mean, the king has not exactly shown himself to be a very tight manager.
That is a fair point that you've made. Okay, let me see if I get this straight. So Thomas Overbury gets locked in prison for defying the king's orders, is left there because he's so annoying he doesn't have any friends who actually want to spring him from prison. Then this whole like murder accusation comes out later that might be real or might be politically motivated, to which there's no real evidence beyond the circumstantial and speculative. So the king decides he's going to get ahead of this by ordering an investigation, figuring that he can just pick someone who will drop it immediately. And instead the guy's like, this is my chance at the big time. So I'm going to make this into the like 17th century trial of the century.
Yes, Coke really blows this up. He has Weston imprisoned and questioned not as a witness, but as a potential conspirator himself. And Weston cracks pretty quickly under pressure. He makes admissions and fingers Mrs. Turner and Dr. Franklin, saying that they were working on behalf of the Howards. In addition to these rumors put about by Carr and the Howards' enemies, Coke is suspicious because Overbury's body was so stinky after death. So if a body decomposed quickly, that was sometimes taken during this period as a sign of poisoning. There are some poisons that do change rates of decomposition, but it certainly was not the case that just because a body was stinky meant that it was poisoned.
Yeah, it seems like a bit of a reach.
But Coke is a man who reaches very far, and he completely buys into this story. So Coke's interrogation strategy relies very heavily on leading questions and coaching witnesses. And even though Richard Weston came forward specifically because he did not want to implicate himself in rumors of Thomas Overbury's death, and even though the story that Weston tells is all about him diverting poison away from the prisoner, Coke tries him, is just completely steamrolls over this poor guy at trial, and a jury finds Weston guilty of murder. Weston is hanged pretty much right away before any other trials go forward. So the trials of the other conspirators start going forward after someone has already been hanged for the conspiracy.
Now, hanging a witness just seems like a bad call. I've never been a prosecutor, but I feel like that's counterproductive, one might say.
Well, I mean, he's already told his whole story. What else could he tell?
How did these people conquer half the planet? Like, I know I made that joke last week, but seriously.
As you might expect from the fact that the court has already gone ahead and carried out Weston's sentence, The results of these trials are pretty much a foregone conclusion. But just because Koch knows how he'd like these trials to end doesn't mean that he can't zhuzh it up a little. He can add a little spice. Because when Anne Turner goes to trial, the witchcraft angle comes into play. The prosecution presents as evidence dirty pictures that were supposedly found in her home, a suspicious doll made out of wax, a parchment with the names of the Trinity written on it profanely, and another parchment with a piece of supposedly human skin attached to it. And they say that all of these items were found in her possession and thus are evidence of witchcraft. And remember from episode 1, what do witches love? Poison.
I mean, okay. Again, a lot of questions. How does one write the name of the Trinity profanely, first of all?
The book I was reading didn't cover that. I would love to know that myself.
I mean, I'll give you this. A piece of parchment with human skin on it is pretty weird. I don't know that it's what I would call definitive evidence of someone being a witch, but hey, we've been ignoring standards up to this point, so why change anything now?
I was a little confused by the parchment with skin on it because I believe this was still a period where people were writing on vellum. So I'm not really sure how you tell the difference between what is supposedly human skin and the actual animal skin that you're writing on.
That is a very good point, actually. Something that a legitimate investigator would probably dive into. So I look forward to a thorough and thoughtful look into the quality of this evidence.
Well, instead of doing exactly what you just said, Koch decides that he is going to make Mrs. Turner's life absolutely miserable during her trial. He does a lot of strange things to humiliate her at court. Like he forces her to take off her hat and mess up her hairstyle. He goes off on this weird thing about how you can't wear a hat to court. And this apparently is very upsetting to her that he is critiquing her appearance while also putting her on trial for murder.
Maybe she will like the hat.
She has a pretty miserable time of it, especially when she finds out that Weston is already dead. So she understands here that she's pretty much being railroaded by the prosecution and that there's not much that she's going to be able to do in her own defense. The prosecution has a distinct advantage in proving their case against Mrs. Turner because in the English legal system at this time, not only do you not have the right to an attorney to defend yourself, there is no such thing as innocent until proven guilty. So the accused are the ones who have the burden of proving that they didn't poison Overbury. And how do you prove that you didn't poison a guy who's been dead for years in the age before any kind of forensic test for poison? Pretty much all you have to go on is hearsay. And in this case, it's the hearsay of a guy who has already been tried, found guilty, and hanged.
Yeah, this seems bad, but also, I guess you can just make shit up in a trial of this period. You don't really need to get it checked, so that's fine. That's cool. Normal.
So yeah, Anne Turner, unsurprisingly, is sentenced to death. And next up are Dr. Franklin and Sir Gervais Elwes, who have separate trials. Each person is tried separately. They're not tried as one big group. Elwes actually holds out for a while and refuses to make a plea at all. He's hoping for a kind of a weird legal technicality if he doesn't make a plea, but it doesn't end up working out for him. Elwes goes down more or less for not convincing Weston hard enough not to pass poison on to Overbury. Remember, Weston's original story is that he didn't pass any poison on to Overbury at all, so the facts are starting to get a little bit jumbled. Franklin, who's the doctor, ends up making a confession blaming everybody else. So he ends up being the one who provides a lot more circumstantial evidence against everybody else. So both of these men are convicted and sentenced to hang. And now the prosecution can turn to the big fish, Francis Howard and Robert Carr. The two are kept separately. Carr is confined at the Tower of London, and Frances is kept elsewhere to await the birth of her child because she's pregnant at this time. Robert's enemies actually, even though Frances is very obviously pregnant when she is questioned by Coke, his enemies spread rumors that she's not really pregnant and that she's just put a cushion up her dress. I assume this is some kind of thing about Frances trying to win the court's sympathy.
I mean, that seems like a pretty easy thing to check, though.
Well, remember, this is also the lady who, according to rumor at least, had a different relative stand in for her own virginity examination. So she's pulled this kind of swapsies scam before.
Oh my god. Well, I look forward to a swift and fair trial in both of these cases, based on the track record so far.
The details of her scandalous affair with Carr while she was still married to her first husband actually come out during Weston's trial. And this greatly humiliates Frances and causes her to lose quite a lot of her reputation at court. But even though the Howard family could have taken this chance to throw the disreputable Frances under the bus, they stand by her. Her brother Thomas stands by her a little bit too aggressively. In fact, his threats to fight anyone who talks badly about her do not go down so well. The king actually has to throw him in prison for a little bit just to cool his heels and to stop him from saying such seditious things, and possibly also to stop him from murdering anyone else during the course of his sister's investigation for murder.
I mean, why not at this point? Just throw a few more in there. Let's have some fun with it.
King James also has to order Frances's mom to leave court for a while because she is causing some trouble by proclaiming her daughter's innocence a little bit too aggressively. The Howards were one hell of a weird family, for sure, but I will give them this. They were absolutely willing to throw down to defend each other. You don't go to the king and ask your sovereign monarch for an annulment due to witch dick unless you really want to protect that kid. Unless you really want to protect your kid.
Yeah, that's what good parenting looks like, I think.
And speaking of parenting, Frances gives birth to her daughter by Robert Carr on December 9th, 1615. She names her Anne after the Queen in the hope that this move will curry some favor and perhaps get the Queen herself to intercede on her behalf.
And does that work?
It does not work well at all. The hope of royal favor is growing more remote. James is getting more distant from Robert Carr due to the scandal and also because he's really cozying up to George Villiers. So, in January 1616, Frances decides, look, I've had my daughter, I've been separated from my husband, my reputation is in tatters. I'm going to take the fall for everything. I am going to confess and say that I did all this myself, and that will hopefully stop the investigation into my husband. So she confesses to representatives of the king and then to Coke himself, saying that she, and she alone, decided to poison Overbury for offending her with things that he'd said about her character. And in fairness to Frances, Overbury did say some pretty fucking vile things about her character. She insists that her husband is completely innocent of murder. She's the one who should get the fall for this. Unfortunately, during this time, Coke's theory has gotten even wilder because Coke has gotten his hands on some more correspondence, and due to a misunderstanding of the context of some of the correspondence he seized from Robert Carr, he has actually become convinced that Robert Carr is not only a poisoner who conspires with witches, he is a secret Spanish agent. And Coke hates Spain. He hates Spain so much.
Quick question, just for the quick question for the court.
Yes?
Is there any evidence to support that position at all?
Carr, in the course of his duties as a politician and as someone who handled the king's correspondence, did have some letters in his possession about payments going on between Spain and some unknown operatives. Coke thinks that Carr is the unknown operative, but he's not. That is completely a misinterpretation. Ironically, though, Carr had actually been attempting in correspondence that Coke didn't have access to convince Spain to pay him for some help, sweetening the deal with some potential arrangements between the monarchy of Spain and the monarchy of England. So he wanted to be a Spanish agent, but he wasn't actually a Spanish agent.
Somehow that's even stupider than if Coke had just made the whole thing up.
Yeah, absolute top to bottom, fantastic incompetence on the part of everybody here. But the reason Coke hates Spain is because the Spanish are Catholics, and Coke hates Catholics. And in this period, if you're a good English Protestant, Catholics are in league with the witches. So Coke takes this opportunity to really ramp up the witchcraft accusations against Carr. He finds a witness, or possibly invents a witness, who claims that Robert decided to murder Thomas Overbury after a wizard showed him the face of a man who posed a threat to him in an enchanted mirror. So now the court is saying that Robert Carr looked in a magic mirror and saw Thomas Overbury, and that's why he decided to poison him.
Sure, whatever. We're just making shit up now. We're lifting shit from Disney. Let's go for it.
And while we're making shit up, Carr gets another wild accusation thrown in his direction. James's heir, Prince Henry, had sadly died of typhoid. He died of typhoid 6 months after attending a banquet planned by Carr. Surely, according to Coke, this means that Carr is guilty of poisoning the heir of England.
Yes, one of those 6-month delayed poisons.
Okay, that sounds like a stretch, but for those of you who spend a little bit less time reading about historical poison than I do want to explain that this is a period in which people believed in the concept of something called a slow poison, meaning a poison that could be undetectable when it was administered and not cause any symptoms for a while, and then suddenly turn fatal months later. Back in the mid-1500s, there were rumors of King Edward VI dying of a slow poison after he died of a strange illness with atypical symptoms. So there's not actually such a thing in real life as a slow poison, but during this time period, people believed that that was actually possible. And so even though Coke is inventing stuff mostly out of whole cloth in a lot of these cases, his belief in slow poison is something that he would have shared with a lot of people from that time period.
Yeah, it's not any weirder than cursed witch dicks.
While we're on the subject of poison, in this time period, it was quite hard to tell the symptoms of poisoning from the symptoms of quite a lot of diseases that were difficult to diagnose and treat. And a lot of medicines during this time period were themselves poisonous. So even if the cause of an illness wasn't poison, the attempt at a cure might be. So if you have reason to be suspicious of a death, and Coke has a lot of reasons why he has decided that he is suspicious of Robert Carr, it's very easy to convince yourself that poisoning was involved and very hard to disprove after the fact that poisoning could have been involved. So on January 19th, 1616, Robert and Frances are indicted as accessories to murder before the fact done. And then they get a lucky break at long last, because the case passes from the fanatical Coke to the much more sensible Attorney General, Sir Francis Bacon. Now, there's a name you've heard before.
Yeah, I guess he's too busy doing science-y shit to really pay too much attention to any of that nonsense.
Well, Francis Bacon has a long-standing beef with Coke. The two had competed for the same positions quite a bit during their time at court. They also competed for the hand of the same woman, and Coke won that one. Bacon did not. So Bacon has a lot of reasons why he distrusts Coke's reasoning here.
Bacon was also famously one of the inventors of the scientific method and the whole idea of skepticism based on rigorous investigation of the evidence, as opposed to just vibes based, I don't know, I don't like these people, so magic poisons and witches.
Bacon was an interesting guy because he very much believed in skepticism in the scientific sense, but he was very much not skeptical of what the king told him to do. So Coke is out for himself. He is not out to serve the king. Bacon is out for the king. Whatever the king wants is what Bacon is going to attempt to deliver. So Bacon receives the evidence that Coke collected, and he decides to ignore some of the more bonkers conspiracy theories about secret Spanish agents and a plot to poison the heir to the throne of England. He just throws all that out. That's ridiculous. Not even going to consider that. But unfortunately for Robert and Francis, King James is now not only refusing to help, but actively encouraging Bacon to find them guilty if the case should proceed to a trial. Because if the case actually proceeds to a trial and then they get acquitted, that acquittal would be very humiliating to the king. And a big splashy trial risks Carr exposing some personal business that James would like to keep quiet. Specifically, Carr might reveal the fact that James's imprisonment of Thomas Overbury was done not so legally. So the ideal for James would be all of this going away quietly. But if Robert Carr must be brought to trial, he must receive a guilty verdict. So, while Francis has confessed, Robert keeps insisting he's innocent. And with their chances of an easy win slipping away, Carr's enemies at court have begun to fight amongst themselves. It turns out that George Villiers, the new favorite, is very much willing to turn on the people who did favors to get him into his position. So this plan to supplant Robert Carr worked a little bit too well, and then George Villiers is not delivering. In April, Frances gets moved into the Tower of London in preparation for her trial. She actually gets lodged in the very same room that Overbury lived and died in, which is something she finds intensely distressing. James continues to dither about whether he wants a trial at all. He doesn't want to be humiliated by having Carr found innocent, but he doesn't want Carr to die either. He still seems to feel something favorable towards him, even though he's moved on to a new favorite. And Carr not only continues to claim he's innocent, but when James sends men to try to convince Carr to plead guilty and get this whole thing over with, Carr strongly implies that he's willing to blackmail the king by spilling some very embarrassing secrets at court. So here's the king's problem. If Carr does confess to murder and plead guilty, the king has a lot of legal options to display mercy. He can decide not to proceed with the trial at all, he can halt the trial, or he can have the trial go ahead but then stay the death penalty. But as long as Carr continues to claim to be innocent, he must be put on trial so the court can determine whether or not he's innocent. And if Carr pleads innocent and then he's put on trial and found guilty, the king actually cannot extend the same kind of mercy. It is specifically the penitence and free confession of the defendant that unlocks the legal options for James to be merciful.
So basically, if the king wants to do anything about this and avoid a whole humiliating thing about technically having lightly illegally imprisoned someone who may have died afterwards, he needs Carr to confess to something he probably didn't do so that the king can then push all this under a rug?
Yes. And Carr is not playing along because Carr is somewhat justifiably insisting that he did not poison Overbury. So the king takes this to Sir Francis Bacon. And Bacon is the kind of legal expert who goes, basically, whatever my king wants, I'll find a way to do that. He argues to James that because the nature of the proof rested chiefly upon presumptions, it might be possible to both convict Carr and to give James enough of an opening to spare him from the death penalty. So, with some careful cherry picking of what evidence he does end up deciding is legitimate, particularly when it comes to the interpretation of some vague pronouns in France's correspondence that might or might not be referring to Carr, Bacon thinks that he can pull this one off. So the case against the couple proceeds to trial. The prosecution is on a very unusual mission. They need to make a strong enough case to be absolutely sure of a guilty verdict, so there's no possibility of the king being humiliated by an acquittal. But they need to make their case just weak enough that the king will have a plausible excuse to doubt the sentence and thus to stay an execution.
And in so doing, he'll save the king's bacon.
Oh, that was an excellent pun, sir.
I was saving that for a little, just for the right opening, you know?
Oh, man. But yeah, keeping that one in your back pocket just for the perfect chance. Well done, sir. To make extra sure that Carr doesn't take the chance of a public trial to spill more than he's supposed to, he gets a very thorough talking to from agents of the king before the trial begins. Francis Bacon originally proposed having two men with cloaks stand behind Carr while he testified, so that if he started saying anything too spicy, the men could throw their cloaks over his head to silence him. Unfortunately, the king decided not to approve of this completely insane legal strategy, depriving us of what I'm sure would have been absolutely fantastic content.
Oh, yeah, of course. This is the spot to draw the line, after all of the very careful adherence to standards of legal propriety.
So finally, on May 24th, Frances Howard's trial begins in Westminster Hall. Frances has already pled guilty. She did so after, because she's confessed, because she was trying to get her husband spared. This trial is actually more about Bacon attempting to prove that Carr was in on the conspiracy too. And thus begins a very strange murder trial conducted in just half an hour. One in which the prosecution actually spends a lot of time trying to reassure the defendant that nobles hardly ever hang for murder. So don't even worry about it. You didn't commit treason, honey. You just poisoned a guy. We're not going to kill you. So just go ahead and tell us your husband's guilty. Wouldn't that be so nice if you could just tell us your husband's guilty, please? Help us out here. Give us a little something to work with here.
Did you just slip into a New York Yenta accent while doing that?
Wow, did I just channel my ancestors there?
A little bit. It was honestly pretty fantastic.
So in contrast to the previous trials preceded over by Coke, Bacon actually does not go into much detail at all about the very murder he is supposed to be prosecuting.
Oh, I wonder why. He has so much good evidence to work with.
He spends much more time on the events that happened after Overbury's death. So, although Francis pleads for mercy from the death sentence, the Lord High Steward who's judging this case does say that murder is a felony and thus the sentence of death is mandatory. The trial, in fact, is over so quickly that as Frances leaves the court, it's unclear whether she even understands that she has been sentenced to death. She still seems to be taking Bacon's assurance that nobles don't really get sentenced to death. So that night, Carr hears about his wife's sentence, and he drags his heels literally. He threatens that he's not even going to go into the building for his own trial unless someone hauls him in there. So he is still absolutely doubling down on that you cannot make me plead guilty. Nobody actually knows for sure how he gets convinced to stand for his own trial. One historical account claims that James passed a message to him through a lieutenant that he was definitely going to be convicted and basically tricks him into showing up for trial. So finally, Carr does show up for his trial. The court is packed with people who are hoping that this is not just going to be a murder trial, but that all of Coke's crazy theories about witchcraft and Spanish treason are going to be part of the proceedings. And unfortunately for those folks, they are disappointed. Bacon handles the defendant very carefully. He really wants to make sure not to piss Carr off so that Carr has no opening with which to blurt out an accusation against the king. So the prosecution's argument in Carr's trial is that the jailer Weston is the one who did the poisoning, and Carr was just the guy who persuaded him to do it. Once again, the details of the actual murder are elided. The Lord High Steward actually tells the prosecution not to bother focusing too much on the exact dates of the poisoning or the type of poison used. All the court cares about is whether Carr convinced Weston to murder Overbury. And of course, Weston isn't around to say anything to the contrary, as he's been hanged quite a while ago. Bacon gives a very dramatic speech in which he argues that poisoning is a particularly horrible crime, one that good Englishmen don't commit, although sneaky Italians do. He argues that because poisoning is such a hard crime to prove objectively, the little details like what and where and when don't really matter.
Wow, that's quite a leap of logic right there.
Yeah, Francis Bacon, very focused on methodology when it came to the scientific method, not so much when it came to legal processes.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, why start now with this particular legal proceeding?
In a stunning reversal from previous cases, Bacon portrays the murder victim not as a saintly man, but as a nasty little schemer who Carr had murdered in order to cover up his own secrets and secure his politically favorable marriage. Carr tries to put up a defense, and he manages okay for a guy who is representing himself in a system where he is not presumed innocent. But even a man as high-ranking and educated as an earl has a hard time standing up to this kind of prosecution. He does end with one banger of a line for his own peers. Quote, "As the king hath raised me to your degree, so he hath now disposed me to your censures."
That is a pretty good line.
Yeah, so James elevated me to this position and thus put me in the position of being tried by all of you.
I mean, he's not wrong. God, what a clusterfuck. Okay, so how does this all shake out?
To nobody's surprise except possibly his own, he is found guilty in a unanimous verdict. Francis and Robert are both sentenced to hang. I should say Francis Howard. It's weird to say Francis Bacon and Francis Howard. They're both Francis here. Francises. But James delays carrying out the sentence. The Earl of Essex, Francis's first husband, Mr. Cursed Dick, is actually in the king's ear at this point. He's begging him to execute his former wife. Remember in part 1 when he argued his marriage had been wrongfully annulled? According to that logic, he can't remarry again unless his wife is dead. So he is really hoping that this murder trial is going to solve his problems.
I mean, that's one way to do it. I like the cursed witch dick route personally, but...
So this is not very convincing for the king. In July, he grants Francis a royal pardon, meaning that Francis Howard is still subject to imprisonment, but not to death. And to Robert Carr, James grants him the liberty of the Tower, meaning that he can wander pretty much wherever so long as he stays within the Tower of London. He even chooses not to expel him from the Order of the Garter, which is a pretty clear sign of royal favor. Carr does lose his titles and his property to the crown. In this time period, if you were convicted of a felony, the crown could seize your property. As you can imagine, this leads to quite a lot of great content for us because the crown does have a certain motivation to go after anyone whose property they want to seize.
It's a system that is in no way abusable.
But James offers Carr a pardon and even some restoration of income-generating land if only he will confess his guilt. So James is just saying, all right, fess up to it, and I will give you money and land back. I really need you to stop publicly humiliating me. Come on, could you just please do that? But Carr refuses. He keeps protesting his innocence. He believes that he has been wrongfully convicted, and he is refusing to take anything less than full restoration of everything that he had before the trial. The couple remain in the tower until 1622. Carr finally gets his pardon from King James in 1624, which is good timing because James actually dies the next year, and James's son, who takes the throne, let's say, not the biggest fan of Robert Carr. Francis and Robert survive, but they don't get their happy ending. Their marriage ends up being an unhappy and possibly an unfaithful one, and Frances does not produce any more children. She dies in her early 30s of a combination of uterine and breast cancer. Apparently, it was a very nasty way to go. Robert dies in debt and estranged from his only daughter, Anne. And there were quite a few mocking epitaphs written for Robert Carr that summed up public sentiments about the couple at the time of his death. I wanted to read my favorite one. Quote, "Here lies he that was once poor, then great, then rich, then loves a whore. He wooed and wedded, but in conclusion, his love and whore was his confusion. A page, a knight, a viscount, and an earl, all four were married to one lustful girl. A match well made, for she was likewise for a wife, a witch, a murderess, and a whore."
I mean, it's got a nice poetry to it. A little problematic in some of the language, but you know.
So, who killed Overbury? Was Overbury even murdered at all? It is true that his health badly deteriorated in the tower, and he was seen by many doctors. So, historian Anne Somerset proposes a theory in her book about this case. One of Overbury's doctors was a man named Theodore, oh my God, I'm going to absolutely butcher this name, Theodore Turquet de Mayerne, and he was a big fan of treating diseases via enema. So this is the enema doctor who's, maybe he was the guy whose
What a
enema got swapped out.
reputation to have where 400 years later, people are like, oh yeah, that's the enema doctor.
Well, he wasn't just an enema doctor because he was a guy who believed in the healing powers of mercury.
Oh,
That's
Jesus
right.
Christ.
This is a guy who tried to cure diseases by shooting mercury up people's butts.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, as we established, that will stop the progression of the disease.
So it is actually possible that Overbury could have died from a poisoned enema, but that nobody swapped out the enema. The mercury-laced enema was what he was supposed to get from his own doctor. That is a possible cause of death.
You know what? I choose to believe it because there's just as much evidence supporting that as any of this other crap, and it would be the most funny way for this to end.
We do also have records of Overbury consuming other medications, like a drinkable gold that had some questionable ingredients that are not safe for human consumption.
It tracks, but I believe it's the mercury butt stuff.
It is very possible that even if the jellies weren't poisoned and the enemas that Overbury was receiving were not deliberately poisoned, he could have died of poisoning because of what his doctors were doing to him. It's possible also, Somerset suggests that Overbury could have been suffering from something else entirely, like untreated diabetes or blood poisoning from a gangrenous wound. So it is possible he could just have bitten it from something completely unrelated to poison and then just, probably didn't help that he was receiving so much poison from his doctors. It is even possible that Frances did send him poisoned food and did genuinely believe she had killed him, but that Weston and Elwes did divert the poison and that Overbury died anyway because his doctors were poisoning him. So if he died of poisoning, it is still very possible he was not murdered.
I think the real moral of this story is not to be such an annoying prick that it's quite possible everyone tried to kill you.
So yeah, that is the story of the death of Sir Thomas Overbury, a man that many people hated enough to want him dead, but who, even if he died of poisoning, quite possibly wasn't murdered.
And that's why you don't shove mercury up your butt, kids. I would ask normally what we can learn from this, but I think Somehow, the answer to that question is both too clear and too obscure to really do anything with.
Yeah, Somerset ends her book by pointing out the extremely obvious sexism angle and going after Frances. It is true that Frances suffered quite a bit from the sexism of her time period, both in her initial marriage difficulties and her difficulty getting out of marriage, also in the way Overbury was treating her, just absolutely willing to paint her as a faithless woman who was a bad wife because of her education. And then, of course, she ends up getting so much of the blame from the public, who are so excited to believe that she is a whore and a witch, despite the fact that she seems like she was trying to save her husband in the end. Even if she maybe did think she was poisoning a guy, she did at least seem to love her husband.
And in fairness, that guy was a huge prick.
So yeah, things don't end well for them. Things don't end well for George Villiers, the new favorite, either. That will probably be the subject of a future episode. He manages to spectacularly bungle some things in a way that gets him assassinated.
As I recall, Francis Bacon also ended his career in political disgrace too. So I think the real moral of the story here is maybe just don't get involved with monarchies.
Well, we did Charles the First, right?
Yeah,
On this, yeah. So this is a monarchy that has to take a little bit of a break shortly afterwards because of how
well,
badly it's been mismanaged.
and I, for one, am filled with like maybe a little bit of sympathy for that. But in the meantime, I would say we've done what we have to do. So if any of our listeners would like to find us and offer their thoughts on other things you shouldn't shove up your butt because they'll probably kill you, where can they reach out to us?
You can find us on our website, facingbackward.com.
We also are on Tumblr, a website I am utterly unfamiliar with, but apparently on tumblr.com slash blog slash facing backward.
Yeah, I'm still sort of waiting to see what the next social media is going to be because I am,
You
let's
don't think it's going to
say,
be X?
well,
Speaking of people who probably have shoved some things up their butt they thought were medicinal.
Yeah, X has, it doesn't seem like it has a very long-term future. I am not really great at TikTok. I've tried it a couple times. I'm not great at it. Don't have that blue sky invite yet, so we're just gonna sit tight and wait and see what comes along next, social media wise.
And in the meantime, if you want to help us become influencers so we get invitations to the new generation of social media, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com slash facing backward.
Yes, we have ad-free episodes for you there. We also have some bonus episodes of us reviewing some very strange historical fiction. Obviously, we had to go off our schedule a bit because Isaac is having a tough time in front of a mic. But I forced you to watch probably your least favorite piece of historical fiction that I forced you to consume.
I mean, I guess I'll save it for the episode.
Yeah, I finally found something weirder than a illegally downloaded Russian vampire show for you to watch. So I'm very excited to discuss that with you when you're feeling better. But we should give shout outs to our generous patrons who make it possible for us to talk about shooting mercury up your butt. They are Ian Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Kieran Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Shimao Toshio's History of Japanesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked.
Would you say that Thomas Koch is a better or worse judge than Samuel Alito?
You know what?
Weigh in on Patreon if you have an opinion on this, everyone.
He shot for the moon and he missed, but by God, he landed among the Spanish conspiracy theories.